Across the American Southwest, especially within Navajo tradition, there are stories about something that moves through the land at night. Something that appears as an animal but doesn't behave like one. A coyote, standing too still in the dark. A dog watching from just beyond the porch light. Footsteps circling a house long after nightfall. And sometimes, something tapping on a window or scratching across the roof. In Navajo or Dene belief, these encounters are often connected to what many people refer to as Skinwalkers, witches who are said to have learned how to take the form of animals through dark rituals and forbidden practices. But this is also a subject that is rarely discussed openly. In fact, many Navajo people avoid speaking about it entirely, believing that even saying the name can attract attention from the very thing being talked about. And I do want to give a brief warning before we get into it. The origins and rituals tied to Skinwalker lore are far darker and more disturbing than many people expect, so listener discretion is advised. Because of that, much of what exists publicly about Skinwalkers comes from fragments, anthropological research, secondhand stories, and accounts shared by people who claim they encountered something they couldn't explain. Welcome to Darkly Speaking. I'm your host, Alex Kern, and if you're joining us for the first time, well, you found your way to a very dark podcast. If you're drawn to true crime, dark history, and unsettling folklore, then you're in the right place. I release new episodes every Monday on chilling and unsettling stories from the world of true crime to the eerie realms of the paranormal. You can also watch full video episodes each week on Spotify and YouTube. Tonight, we're talking about Skinwalkers, otherwise known in Navajo as Yi-Nadlushi. We're going to look at the Navajo or Dene lore and history connected to these stories, the beliefs behind them, and several encounters that people say change the way they see the darkness around them. Much of the information I'll be sharing comes from anthropologist Clyde Clacone and his book, Navajo Witchcraft, as well as research and perspectives shared by YouTuber Sean Clyn Shadow Productions, both of which I'll link in the description below. Before we begin, a quick note for my audio listeners. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you enjoy the show, please take a second to leave a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. And, of course, wherever you are, don't forget to follow, like, or subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. All right, without further ado, let's begin. Before diving into the folklore, the history, and the cultural context surrounding Skinwalkers, it helps to begin with the kinds of encounters people claim to have had. Across the American Southwest, stories circulate quietly about animals behaving in ways that feel wrong. People describe creatures appearing near homes late at night, watching from the dark, or moving in ways that don't quite match the animal they appear to be. But most of these stories are usually told casually, almost reluctantly, shared between friends or family members as something strange that happened once and was never fully explained. One of those stories begins near Tuba City, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation. Two college friends had decided to spend a few days visiting one of their grandmothers who had lived there. The house sat in a remote area outside town, surrounded by open land and a few scattered homes, where the nights were quiet and the nearest neighbor might be miles down the road. The first day passed without anything unusual. The girls settled in, spent time with the grandmother, and enjoyed the calm peace of the reservation. At one point during the day, the grandmother casually mentioned that a stray dog had appeared on the property recently and wouldn't leave. It had shown up out of nowhere and had been lingering around the house ever since. The dog was large, black, and shaggy, something that looked roughly like a mix between a German Shepherd and a Labrador. But there was something else that stood out. The other dogs on the property completely avoided it. They kept their distance, refusing to go near it. On many Navajo reservations, dogs are not typically kept inside the home the way they often are elsewhere. They usually roam outside freely and are seen as protectors of the household and property. They are deeply valued animals within the culture, cared for and respected, which made the other dog's behavior towards this one stand out even more. At the time, the comment didn't seem important. Stray dogs wandering through those areas weren't uncommon, and the girls didn't think much about it. Later that evening, the girls were sitting in the living room watching a movie. The room had large windows that faced the front yard, offering a clear view of the area outside the house. At one point, one of the girls we'll call Karen stood up to return a DVD to the bookshelf that sat near one of those windows. As she reached the shelf, she happened to glance outside, and that's when she saw it. The stray dog was standing in the yard, balanced on top of a wooden storage box that sat beneath the window. It was staring directly into the house. This struck the girls as strange, but again, nothing too out of the ordinary. Karen immediately stepped outside and chased it away. The dog jumped down from the box and disappeared behind a nearby shed. After that, the girls left for a short trip into town to pick up a few groceries. When they returned later, they didn't see the dog again, and for a while, it seemed like the strange moment had passed. But not long after they got home, the grandmother left the house to visit friends, leaving the two girls alone for a few hours that evening. Sometime later, they heard something at the front door. At first, it sounded like someone outside testing the handle, trying to turn the doorknob. What made the moment strange, though, was that neither of them had heard a car pull up. Out in that rural area, vehicles were usually easy to hear long before anyone reached the house. Even the dogs outside would normally start barking if someone was near the home. But this time, everything had been quiet. They moved toward the window, parted the curtain, and looked outside. The stray dog had returned, but something about it was wrong. It wasn't standing on all four legs anymore. It was upright. The animal was balanced on its hind legs, its front paws wrapped around the doorknob as if trying to twist it open. Terrified, the girls backed away from the door, but when the jiggling of the handle wouldn't stop, Karen swung open the door and, once again, chased the creature off the front porch. Eventually, the movement outside stopped and the dog disappeared again into the darkness. Later that night, when Karen's grandmother returned home, Karen told her what had happened. The grandmother immediately told them that she didn't like what they were describing. After some time passed, the girls eventually went to bed in the spare bedroom of the grandmother's house. One of the windows was slightly open, the curtains pulled back just a little. They turned off the lights and tried to settle in for the night. Not long after, they began hearing noises above them, sounds coming from the roof. Footsteps, scratching, and what sounded like heavy panting. Something was moving across the roof above them, fast and heavy. Then, suddenly everything went quiet. A moment later, whatever was up there broke into a sprint across the roof, and with a loud thud, it jumped down onto a water barrel sitting just outside the house. Moments later, barking erupted somewhere near the yard. At first, it sounded like an ordinary dog. Then, the other dogs on the property began barking too as something started running around the outside of the house. But after a few seconds, the sound began to change. The barking became uneven and distorted, the tone dropping lower and deeper until it no longer sounded like a dog at all. Instead, it sounded almost human, like a deep male voice trying to imitate the sound of a dog barking as it circled the house, as if it knew. The girls inside understood it wasn't really a dog. The two girls lay in the dark listening, trying to make sense of the sound outside, but the longer they listened, the clearer it became. Whatever was moving out there was not a dog. The noise stopped. Then, just outside the slightly open window, they heard something breathing. Slow, heavy panting that sounded disturbingly human. At this point, the two girls are terrified and freaked out, frozen in place for a few moments until finally, Karen got up and walked quietly to the window. She pulled back the curtain just enough to look outside. The stray dog was there again, upright on two legs, pressed close to the window and looking into the bedroom. Even through the slightly open window, they could smell the stench coming off its body. As the girls looked closer, they immediately noticed two dark holes in its neck. Holes that looked disturbingly like human eyes. And from that distance, something else became clear. The front paws didn't look like paws anymore. They looked more like long, deformed hands with overgrown, thick, sharp fingernails. The creature stood there, staring directly into the room. They yanked the curtains closed and began screaming. Karen's grandmother came running into the room, and for a brief moment, she saw it standing there at the window. The first thing she did was grab ashes from the fireplace. Then, she pulled a shotgun from under her bed, loaded 3 shells into it, and blessed herself in Navajo before stepping outside. Standing in the darkness, she began shouting in Navajo that whatever that thing was, it was not welcome there and needed to leave the property now. Whatever was out there seemed to have left, and the rest of the night went on without incident. The next morning, the grandmother called a medicine man to come to the house. A ceremonial cleansing was performed to rid the property of negative energy, with cedar smoke filling the rooms as prayers were spoken throughout the home. Protective herbs and arrowheads were given to them all to carry for protection. Only after the ceremony ended did the medicine man explain what the grandmother had already suspected. The animal outside the house had not been a normal dog. It was a Unnatural, a skinwalker, using the body of a stray dog it had killed and wearing its hide so that anyone who saw it would believe it was simply a normal stray dog. He also warned that these beings are believed to harm people in unusual ways. They can use hollow human bone, like a straw, to spit tiny fragments of bone into a person's body, almost like tiny bone darts that are nearly undetectable. To demonstrate what he meant, the medicine man performed a healing on the grandmother. During the ceremony, he pulled a piece of human skull from her right shoulder, about 2 inches long and nearly a centimeter thick. The girls watched him remove it themselves. And, according to him, the Skinwalker had stayed because it knew the girls had recognized what it really was. After hearing a story like the one that just unfolded, the natural question becomes simple. What exactly is a Skinwalker? Well, stories about shape-shifting creatures exist in many cultures around the world, but the term Skinwalker itself comes specifically from Navajo or Dene folklore. And within that tradition, these beings are not understood as monsters or supernatural animals. They are believed to be witches. In Navajo belief, Skinwalkers are not a separate category of creature. Instead, skinwalking is something witches do. A skinwalker is essentially a witch in animal form, someone who has learned how to transform into an animal as part of their practice of witchcraft. Because of this, the more accurate question may not actually be what is a skinwalker, but rather, what is a witch within Navajo belief? Much of what outside researchers know about Navajo witchcraft comes from the work of anthropologist Clyde Clacone. While studying Navajo communities in the early 20th century, Clacone documented accounts describing several different forms of malevolent supernatural activity, each with its own Navajo name. Since these terms don't translate easily into English, Clacone assigned approximate English equivalents when writing about them. He grouped them broadly into 3 categories: witchery, sorcery, and wizardry. Those words shouldn't be interpreted the same way they appear in European folklore. In Navajo belief, each carries a far more specific meaning tied to cultural traditions and spiritual practices. The category most closely connected to skinwalkers is what Clacone referred to as witchery. Skinwalking itself is not a separate classification, it's considered a practice within witchcraft, a transformation learned as part of becoming a witch. In this sense, a skinwalker is someone practicing witchcraft who has learned how to take the form of an animal. According to Clacone's research, witches in Navajo belief are also strongly associated with death and the dead. They are connected to acts and behaviors considered deeply taboo within Navajo culture. Historically, suspicion surrounding certain actions could lead to accusations of witchcraft, and accusations of witchcraft could arise from perceived violations of cultural norms. In that way, witchcraft was not simply about possessing supernatural abilities. It represented a reversal of social and spiritual values. Accounts of who becomes a skinwalker vary depending on the storyteller. Practitioners are believed to be either male or female, though many stories describe them as men. Some of the accounts Clacone collected suggested that female witches were often described as older women. Other informants claimed that women with children could not be witches at all. These beliefs were not universally agreed upon and often depended on who was recounting the tradition. What is consistent across many stories, however, is the motivation behind witchcraft. Acts of witchery are usually described as being driven by jealousy, vengeance, greed, or pure malice. Because of that, witches are often believed to target individuals who appear wealthier, more successful, or higher in social status, along with those people's families and close friends. The Navajo term, most commonly translated as skinwalker, is Unnatural. The phrase is often interpreted to mean something close to, "with it, he goes on all fours." The wording reflects the belief that the witch takes on the form and movement of an animal. According to many accounts, someone who practices this form of witchcraft lives a double life. Their identity as a witch remains hidden from the surrounding community. Some stories claim that skinwalkers may operate within small, secretive groups, though their activities remain concealed from the wider population. Skinwalker stories are most strongly connected to the Four Corners region of the southwestern United States, the point where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado meet. This landscape is significant because it includes traditional Navajo lands as well as the four sacred mountains that hold deep meaning within Navajo cosmology. Many stories claim that the power of skinwalkers is tied directly to this land. Skinwalkers are believed to transform into animals, most commonly coyotes, wolves, deers, particularly bucks, and other large predatory animals. Taking on these forms would allow them to move through the landscape unnoticed and approach potential victims under the cover of darkness. One important aspect of Navajo tradition is that skinwalkers are rarely discussed openly. Many people believe that speaking about them unnecessarily can attract attention or invite bad luck. For that reason, much of the discussion that exists publicly about skinwalkers comes from anthropologists, researchers, or secondhand accounts rather than direct explanation from within the community itself. Stories about how skinwalkers first came into existence vary depending on who is actually telling the story. One version describes medicine men who learned how to shapeshift in order to travel quickly across the land while performing healing ceremonies. Mastering these transformations required years of learning ceremonial songs and rituals. According to legend, some individuals wanted an easier path to that power. Instead of following the long process of learning the traditional way, they turned to darker ceremonies and gained the ability to shapeshift more quickly, but at the cost of becoming something malevolent. Another account suggests that some shamans turned to dark magic during periods of hardship when their people were displaced from their land. The powers were believed to help defend the tribe and ensure survival. But when the people eventually returned to their homeland, those who had learned the darker practices were expected to abandon them. Some did not. Instead, the knowledge was kept secret and passed down quietly through generations. Regardless of how the stories begin, skinwalkers are almost always described the same way in the end. Figures that move in secrecy, appearing mostly at night, often taking the form of animals. And for people who claim to encounter them, the experience tends to begin in the way that feels strangely ordinary at first. Something outside the house, something moving in the darkness, something watching. And sometimes, something that moves with such speed, it's said to keep up with vehicles on the road. Encounters like the ones people describe across the Southwest often happen in quiet, isolated moments. Late at night, far from towns, on empty roads where the landscape stretches into darkness. The next account comes from a childhood memory. A boy we'll call Joe recalls driving home with his uncle after the two of them had spent the evening gathering firewood for his grandmother. By the time they finished chopping and loading the wood into the truck, the sun had already dropped low and the sky was beginning to darken. The two climbed into the truck and started the drive home along a narrow dirt road, the vehicle moving at around 30 miles an hour as it rolled through the quiet desert landscape. Partway through the drive, Joe suddenly felt something he couldn't quite explain. It was the unmistakable awful sensation of being watched. The feeling was strong enough that he began turning toward the passenger side window, trying to look outside to see what might be there. But before he could turn his head all the way, his uncle suddenly shouted, "Don't." Joe froze instantly, his heart pounding in his chest as the truck filled with a tense, sudden silence. A moment later, still staring straight ahead, he heard it. Tap, tap. The sound came from the passenger side window right beside him. They were still moving down the road at several miles an hour, so what could tap on the window while the truck was still driving? Without hesitation, Joe's uncle pressed harder on the gas, the truck picking up speed along the dirt road as he began praying out loud in his native language while they drove faster into the darkness. For a brief moment, Joe thought whatever had made that sound was gone. Then, the truck suddenly dipped downward. The back of the vehicle dropped slightly as if something heavy had landed in the bed of the truck. The uncle kept driving, and without taking his eyes off the road, he shouted over and over, "Look at me, don't turn away. Look at me, don't turn away." Joe tried to do exactly that, forcing himself to keep his eyes on his uncle. But then, he heard another sound. Tap, tap. This time, it came from the rear window behind him. Fear rose in Joe's chest so quickly he struggled to breathe, and for a moment, all he wanted to do was cry. Every instinct told him to turn around and look, but he remembered his uncle's warning and forced himself to keep facing forward. A minute or two had passed, then the truck dipped again, the back end shifting slightly as if whatever had landed there had left. Joe's uncle glanced up and down the dark road ahead and behind them, scanning their surroundings before finally letting out a quiet sigh of relief. Everything had gone quiet again except for the hum of the truck and the sound of tires moving over the dirt road. After a moment, Joe's uncle finally spoke. He looked over at Joe and said in Navajo, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." For the rest of the drive home, Joe curled into the passenger seat and stared at the clock on the truck's radio, watching the minutes pass. His uncle kept driving, quietly singing an old prayer as they continued along the dirt road until they finally reached his grandmother's house. Years later, as an adult, Joe had a nightmare one night about the incident. The memory of that night came back so vividly that he eventually called his uncle to talk about it. During that conversation, he asked his uncle what he had actually seen that night. His uncle spoke in Navajo. "I didn't see faces, just eyes. Like brake lights you see on the road, it watched you." Before hanging up, Joe tried to laugh the whole thing off and asked his uncle a question he had been wondering about for years. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" There was a pause on the other end of the phone. No laughter. Then, his uncle answered, "Because it wasn't alone." Encounters like the one on that dirt road tend to share certain patterns. A presence somewhere in the darkness, something tapping on windows or following vehicles. According to Navajo lore, these details aren't random, they're actually a part of how skinwalkers are believed to operate. Skinwalkers are traditionally described as acting with entirely malevolent intent. Their actions are often said to be driven by greed, envy, revenge, or the pursuit of power. Within Navajo belief, many unexplained misfortunes, things like sudden illness, crop failures, or unexpected deaths, were sometimes attributed to the work of witches practicing these forms of dark magic. In that sense, the goal of a skinwalker is rarely random chaos. Their actions are believed to be purposeful, aimed either at harming others or increasing their own power through witchcraft. And in more traditional accounts, they are also described as being grave robbers. Anthropologist Clyde Clacone documented that witches were believed to steal items buried with the dead, along with parts of the body itself. Human remains were believed to play an important role in their practices. Corpse flesh was sometimes described as a key ingredient used in preparing poisons. In certain traditions, flesh taken from children, particularly twins, was believed to carry special power. Bones from certain parts of the body, including the back of the skull, were also said to be highly valued materials. These materials were often dried and ground into a powder. The powder could then be used to cause illness or paralysis in a victim. People who were believed to have been affected sometimes reported symptoms such as fainting, lockjaw, swelling of the tongue, sudden loss of consciousness, or other unexplained illnesses that seemed to appear without warning. Small bone splinters were also described as being used in a similar way to darts, inflicting pain or sickness when they struck the body. Once the target had succumbed to the powder and died, the witch would wait until darkness fell, then return to dig up the victim's grave, taking their belongings as well as flesh and other body parts. Anthropological sources also describe a practice sometimes referred to as fee splitting. In these accounts, witches were believed to work together in secret. One skinwalker might secretly cause illness in a victim. Then, another witch, posing as a healer or medicine man, would perform a ceremony meant to cure that sickness. When payment was made for the ceremony, the two would divide the money between them. Contrary to the way skinwalkers are often portrayed in modern horror stories, shapeshifting itself was not always believed to be primarily used for attacking people directly. Instead, the ability to take on animal form allowed a witch to travel quickly and remain unrecognized. In human form, a witch would leave human footprints and could potentially be identified. In animal form, however, they could move long distances through the landscape while leaving behind only animal tracks. The transformation itself is often described as involving the wearing of dead animal skins. They would remove the bones, and the hide would be placed over the body, sometimes with sticks inserted to help move the limbs of the skin. Strings could be attached to the ears of the hide so they could be moved as well. Because of this, witnesses sometimes described noticing unnatural movements, ears twitching in odd ways, legs moving stiffly, or tails hanging limp rather than moving naturally. Certain animals appear repeatedly in these accounts. Coyotes are the most commonly mentioned, but wolves, deer, and other large animals are also frequently associated with skinwalkers. Bears and mountain lions are also mentioned in some traditions, though these animals are considered sacred and are believed to be far more difficult to use for dark purposes. For that reason, only the most powerful witches were said to be capable of using those skins. In animal form, a skinwalker might approach a person's home quietly under the cover of darkness. Traditional Navajo homes, known as hogans, were also described as common targets. According to Clacone, the witch was said to climb onto the roof and drop poison powder through the smoke hole. In others, the witch might enter the dwelling itself and apply the powder before escaping into the night. They would also use this power to paralyze the protectors of the home, such as the dogs. Within many Navajo households, dogs are highly valued and respected because they are seen as the protectors of the home and the property. The powder was believed to temporarily subdue them, so they would not interfere. People who believed a skinwalker visited their home described several warning signs: animals behaving strangely or becoming agitated, dogs barking or refusing to go near a particular area, dirt or debris falling from the roof or through the smoke hole, unusual tracks surrounding the home, the smell of decay or death, glowing animal eyes outside windows, or the sound of tapping and scratching on doors, walls, or roofs. Another behavior associated with skinwalkers is mimicry. Skinwalkers are said to imitate sounds in order to lure people outside. Sometimes they mimic the noises of animals. In other stories, they are said to imitate the voices of loved ones calling from the darkness. The goal, according to those accounts, is to draw someone out of the safety of their own home and into the night. They are also described as moving with unusual speed. In animal form, they are said to travel extremely quickly across the landscape. Some traditions even claim they can keep pace with vehicles traveling along remote back roads. Most stories place their activity at night because darkness helps conceal their identity, and some traditions claim that daylight can trap them in whatever animal form they are wearing forever. If a family suspected that a skinwalker had visited their home, they might sometimes attempt to follow the tracks left behind. Those tracks are often described as unusually large or distorted compared to the tracks of ordinary animals. In certain stories, the tracks could lead directly to another person's home within the community. Within traditional belief, if the identity of a skinwalker became known, the consequences were severe. The punishment for a confirmed skinwalker was death. This was considered justified because the acts associated with skinwalkers, murder, grave robbing, and the violation of cultural taboos, were viewed as extreme crimes against the community. When not stalking victims, skinwalkers would gather together at night. These gatherings are said to involve dark ceremonies and rituals. These rituals were sometimes said to include sacrifice and other deeply taboo practices. Skinwalkers are said to move quietly through the landscape, approaching slowly under the cover of darkness with malevolent intent, watching homes, moving through trees and open desert, waiting for the moment when someone finally notices them. And sometimes, the encounter begins the same way many people say it has before, something moving just beyond the edge of the forest. Many encounters described in skinwalker lore begin in places where homes sit close to wilderness or near a reservation, places where the forest begins just beyond the yard, where something could stand in the tree line and watch without being seen easily. One account comes from someone who grew up in a house built directly beside a forest. The storyteller, we'll call him Sean, was 8 years old when his family moved into the home. The house sat right at the edge of the woods, with the backyard ending where the trees began. At first, his parents had some concerns about the location. They worried about wildlife, about the children wandering too far into the forest. Despite those concerns, the house was affordable and secluded, which made it appealing. For the children, the woods felt exciting. They imagined exploring the trees behind the backyard and spending time outside. The first unusual sign involved the family dogs. The dogs refused to enter the forest under any circumstances. If a toy rolled past the tree line, the dogs would not retrieve it. When someone in the family stepped into the woods, the dogs would pace anxiously in the yard until that person returned. At times, the dogs would stand facing the trees, barking or growling at something that no one else could see. One day, Sean's brother tried to prove that there was nothing to worry about. He carried one of the dogs into the forest to show that there was nothing there. The moment the dog touched the ground, it broke free from his arms and ran back toward the house in a panic. As time passed, Sean and his siblings began noticing other strange things. When they played outside near dusk, they would sometimes hear footsteps moving through the forest, branches shifting, sticks crunching as if someone were walking through the trees. Whenever they called out to ask who was there, no one would answer. Occasionally, a flashlight beam would catch what looked like the outline of a person moving in the distance. But the figure would disappear almost immediately, slipping back into the darkness between the trees. After several experiences like this, Sean's parents set clear boundaries. The children were no longer allowed to enter the forest at night. Even during the day, they were told not to wander far enough that the house was out of sight. Not long after that, Sean's sister had her own experience. Her bedroom window faced the backyard and the forest beyond it. One night, she noticed a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the yard. The shape of the figure looked wrong. Not quite human, but not quite animal either. It seemed slightly too tall. The outline looked distorted, and it appeared as though the figure was not quite touching the ground. She became convinced it was staring directly at her. Terrified, she called for her father and told him that there was a man standing in the yard. Her father rushed outside with a flashlight and swept the beam across the backyard, but the moment the light passed over where the figure had been standing, it was simply gone. Another pattern soon developed inside the house. At night, the family would often hear knocking at the back door. When someone opened the door to see who was there, no one would be standing outside. One night, during heavy rain, the knocking became more aggressive and persistent. Sean's mother assumed someone might need shelter from the storm and opened the door quickly, but there was no one there, and despite the rain pouring down, there were no wet footprints anywhere on the porch. The knocking continued throughout the years the family lived there. Eventually, Sean's parents installed a security camera facing the back door, hoping to catch whoever was out there, but the camera never showed anyone at the door. About 3 years after moving into the house, Sean's brother began experiencing night terrors and episodes of sleepwalking. Whenever he sleepwalked, he would open the back door and begin walking toward the forest. Fortunately, their mother was a light sleeper, and she would hear the back door open and stop him before he could reach the trees. Eventually, Sean's brother became curious and asked to see the security footage from the camera. The recordings showed him stepping onto the porch while still asleep. Each time, he would pause for a moment as if listening to something. Then, he would shake his head. After that, he would slowly start walking forward again, almost reluctantly, as if something unseen was pulling or guiding him toward the forest. Not long after, something else happened. One evening, their father heard Sean's sister calling for help from inside the forest. Her voice sounded frightened, as if she had gotten hurt, so without hesitation, he immediately ran toward the trees. But before going any farther, he went back inside the house to grab a flashlight. When he stepped into the house, he saw the sister sitting safely inside. Months later, Sean experienced something similar. While outside in the yard with the dogs, he heard his mother's voice calling from somewhere inside the forest. The voice said she was stuck in branches and needed help. Believing their mother was in trouble, Sean started walking toward the trees. Suddenly, the dogs began barking loudly, which caught their father's attention. He ran outside and told Sean to come back immediately. Their mother was inside the house the entire time. After that incident, the parents built a fence around the backyard and began making plans to move. But during the time before they left, the activities seemed to intensify. The knocking at the door became more frequent, tapping sounds began appearing on the windows, scratching and scraping noises were sometimes heard along the roof and the fence, and occasionally, voices could be heard somewhere beyond it. One night, Sean's brother sleepwalked again. This time, their mother didn't hear the door open. He later woke up standing at the fence, staring out into the forest while the dogs barked frantically at him. On the final morning before the family moved away, something strange happened one last time. The back door was found wide open. When the security footage was reviewed, the camera showed the door slowly swinging open by itself. After the family moved away from the house, the brother's sleepwalking episodes stopped completely. However, he continued to experience night terrors and anxiety for years afterward. Much later in life, he called Sean after having a nightmare about the house and the forest behind it. During that conversation, he wondered out loud whether the final door opening might have meant that whatever had been watching them from the trees for years had finally managed to get inside. He tried to joke about the idea, but it was clear the experiences from that house had never really left him, or any of them for that matter. Encounters like this raise unsettling questions. What exactly was in the forest behind that house, and why did it seem so determined to lure someone out into the dark? Some encounters tied to Skinwalker lore are not described as isolated events. Instead, they seem connected to particular places, areas where something dark is believed to linger, like a burial site. One story passed down within a family centers around a remote property in eastern Arizona, near the town of Snowflake in Navajo County, located in the east central region of the state. The storyteller, who we'll call Anna, said her grandparents owned roughly 80 acres of barren desert land there, purchased in the early 1980s after her grandfather retired from working in the mining industry. The landscape was stark and open. Red sandstone bluffs rose from the desert floor, surrounded by dry washes, scattered juniper and cedar trees, and long stretches of red sand. There were very few neighbors in the area, and the closest relatives lived about a mile away. Another neighbor, a rancher named Stoddard, lived farther out, roughly 4 miles away at the base of one of the bluffs. Stoddard had a reputation in the area as a difficult rancher. He was known for cutting Anna's grandfather's barbed wire fences so his cattle could wander onto neighboring land in order to graze. The area also contained many ancient Anasazi Pueblo ruins. Before continuing with the story, it's worth briefly addressing the term Anasazi, which has historically been used to describe the ancient indigenous people who lived in the southwest United States from roughly 200 BCE to around 1500 CE and built the well-known cliff dwellings throughout the region. The word comes from the Navajo term, often translated as something along the lines of enemy ancestors. Because the term originates outside the culture of the people it refers to, and because many modern descendants, such as Hopi, Zuni, and Pueblo communities, consider it inappropriate, many scholars and indigenous communities now prefer the term Ancestral Puebloans. For the sake of respect, I'll be using the term Ancestral Puebloans moving forward. By that time, a number of those sites had already been damaged by ranchers and artifact hunters searching for pottery and relics they could sell. One day, after losing one of his calves, Stoddard discovered something unusual near the base of a bluff. There was a cave entrance sealed by a large sandstone slab. Using a backhoe, Stoddard removed the slab and discovered the cave was actually an ancestral Puebloan burial site. Instead of reporting the find, he began removing artifacts from the cave and selling them. According to the story, not long after disturbing the burial site, Stoddard's life began to unravel. Within just a few years, he lost nearly $500,000 in the stock market. His cattle contracted a disease and died. His wife developed a rare illness and passed away. Not long after that, Stoddard was thrown from his horse in an accident that left him permanently unable to walk. Convinced that the burial site had cursed him, Stoddard eventually returned the remaining artifacts to the cave and resealed the entrance. Sometime in the late 1980s, he abandoned the ranch and disappeared. A few years later, the empty ranch house was purchased by a man from California who began renting it out. Anna's aunt and her husband eventually moved into the house. It was still fully furnished from the previous owner. At the time, her aunt was pregnant and had relocated to Snowflake to be closer to family. Her husband worked nights at the local paper mill, which meant she often spent evenings alone at the ranch house. At first, the property simply felt unsettling after dark. It was very creepy out there, especially at night, and the isolation made every sound even louder. But soon, stranger things began happening. During the night, Anna's aunt began hearing faint sounds drifting across the desert. Low chanting, accompanied by what sounded like drums. At first, she assumed the noise might be coming from someone living on a bluff roughly a mile away. Even with that explanation, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from outside. Not long after moving in, she also began having nightmares every night. When the grandfather heard about the disturbances, he loaned her his dog for protection. But when she drove the dog out to the ranch house, it refused to get out of the truck. Its fur stood on end and it growled continuously. Once she managed to bring it inside, the dog spent the entire night staring at the door, growling and barking toward the darkness outside. That same night, the chanting and drum sounds returned, this time louder. The next morning, Anna's aunt walked outside and discovered something even more disturbing. Bare human footprints surrounded the house. For about a week, the same pattern continued. The dog barked and growled through the night. The nightmares prevented her from sleeping. Bare footprints appeared around the house each morning. And the chanting and drum sounds seemed to grow louder each night. Eventually, her aunt called her grandmother and asked her to come stay overnight because she felt like she was losing her mind. Anna's grandmother arrived in the late afternoon after finishing chores at her own home, planning to make a hot meal for her aunt. While her aunt rested inside, the grandmother stepped out for a short walk near the base of the bluff, hoping to find pottery fragments or arrowheads the way people sometimes did in that area. While walking, she suddenly felt something that made her stop. The overwhelming sense that something was watching her. The feeling made her skin crawl. She later described the feeling as deeply unsettling, almost evil. A deeply religious woman, she began praying quietly as she returned to the house. When she returned to the house, the grandmother chose not to mention the feeling to Anna's aunt. Instead, she gently suggested that the aunt stay at her house that night, and the aunt agreed. As the sun began setting behind the bluff, the grandmother, the aunt, and the dog gathered their things and loaded into the truck. But when the grandmother turned her keys, the engine wouldn't turn over. She tried again, but nothing. Once more, but still nothing. Neither being mechanically inclined, they tried calling the grandfather for help, but couldn't reach him. With no other option, they grabbed their things from the truck and returned inside the house to wait. Night eventually fell, leaving the area in complete darkness. There was no moonlight. The dog began growling again, and soon the chanting and drum sounds returned, louder than before. The grandmother continued praying while repeatedly trying to call the grandfather. At one point, they heard a howl outside the house, but it didn't sound like a normal coyote. It was something far more ominous. Then something began moving, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Both women were terrified. Eventually, the grandfather answered the phone, and the grandmother, now frantic, pleaded with him to come to the house immediately. She told him something was outside. After what felt like hours, the headlights of the grandfather's truck finally appeared over a hill in the distance. As he drove toward the house, something suddenly ran across the road in front of his headlights. For a brief moment, the lights illuminated a large animal-like figure. The grandfather slammed on the brakes, jumped out of the truck, shouting for them to get in, and fired several shots toward the creature. They climbed into the truck and sped away down the dirt road toward the grandparents' house. As they drove off, the aunt looked back toward the ranch. She later said she saw red eyes watching them from the darkness. The following day, the grandfather and an uncle returned to the ranch house to check the property. In the sand around the house, they found bare human footprints. Mixed among them were extremely large coyote tracks. After that night, Anna's aunt and grandmother refused to ever return to the ranch house. The aunt and her husband moved in with the grandparents instead. Anna's grandmother later claimed that, on some nights, she could still see red eyes watching from the edge of her property. Others who rented the ranch house afterward reportedly moved out within a month or two. According to Native Americans in the region, beings like skinwalkers are believed to frequent burial sites and graveyards, looting them for bones and body parts. Some traditions also say these beings will terrorize people in order to drive them away from burial grounds and ruins. If accounts like this are to be believed, skinwalkers seem drawn to places connected to death and burial. Ancient ruins, forgotten caves, and the quiet stretches of land where the living and the dead meet. Up to this point, most of the stories we talked about focus on what skinwalkers are believed to do: appearing near houses, moving through the darkness, watching from the edges of the land. But the question that naturally follows is how someone becomes one in the first place. Well, within Navajo belief, this transformation is not accidental or symbolic. It's believed to come from heinous rituals that violate nearly every moral and spiritual law within the culture. Becoming a witch capable of skinwalking is said to require far more than just learning spells or poison recipes. Accounts describe a formal initiation process tied to dark ceremonies. These rituals are believed to occur during secret gatherings called witches' sabbaths, meetings that take place far from communities, often in remote caves or hidden locations deep in the landscape. According to accounts documented by anthropologist Clyde Clacone, witches were believed to gather together during these ceremonies. Participants would remove their clothing and wear masks and jewelry. They would sit in a circle surrounded by baskets containing dried flesh taken from corpses. Some descriptions even speak of human heads placed along the cave walls, watching over the ceremony. These gatherings were said to involve rituals and acts considered deeply taboo and condemned by Navajo society. Initiation required breaking the most sacred cultural rules. The acts described in these ceremonies were considered profoundly depraved within Navajo tradition. The purpose, according to the lore, was to sever the initiate from the moral and spiritual structure of their community. Only after crossing that boundary could someone gain the supernatural abilities associated with witchcraft. One of the most disturbing elements described in the stories is the ultimate taboo, the requirement for the initiate to kill someone close to them. The victim could be a sibling, a parent, a spouse, or a close friend. Their body would then be brought back to the ritual gathering and used as part of the ceremony. In the belief system behind these stories, that act permanently separates the initiate from the values and spiritual protection of their people. Some traditions suggest that skinwalkers were once powerful medicine men who turned away from healing. Instead of using their knowledge for protection and balance, they chose to pursue darker power. Through forbidden rituals, they were believed to gain abilities granted by malevolent spiritual forces. After initiation, witches were said to prepare animal pelts for transformation. The animals used for these skins had to be killed by the witch themselves. Predatory animals were most commonly associated with the practice: coyotes, wolves, and deer. The pelts were marked with symbols and prepared through ceremonies before being worn. Different animals were believed to serve different purposes. Smaller animals like foxes and coyotes could allow a witch to move quietly and unseen, while larger predators provided power and intimidation. Some stories even claim that powerful witches could take the form of smaller animals such as birds or rabbits. In these accounts, the transformation allowed them to travel quickly across the landscape while avoiding recognition. One of the most disturbing stories recorded by Clyde Lacone involves a teenage boy who narrowly escaped becoming part of such a ritual. The account was shared with him by Navajo informants and later documented in his research. According to the story, the boy was approached one night by two individuals who told him they were taking him to a sing, a ceremonial gathering typically led by healers. Believing it to be a legitimate ceremony, he agreed to go with them. But as they traveled farther and farther away from the community, he realized they were headed somewhere unfamiliar, farther than any ceremony he had attended before. Eventually, they arrived at a place where a door was set into the ground. One of the men blew a whistle similar to those used during ceremonial rituals. The door slowly opened, revealing an underground passage leading down into a cave. Inside, the boy found a group of witches already gathered. At first, the group appeared confused. They had expected the two men to return carrying a dead body for the ritual. When they saw the boy instead, one of them demanded to know why he had been brought there. While the boy waited, another whistle sounded outside. Two more witches entered the cave carrying the body of a dead woman. They carried the body into another chamber. As the boy looked around the cave, he began to notice piles of dried corpse flesh stored throughout the space. That's when he realized where he had been taken. A man the boy recognized approached him and attempted to reassure him. The witches told him that they wanted him to join them. They began showing him the contents of the cave: piles of preserved flesh, turquoise beads, and animal skins used for transformation. They explained that they would teach him how to use the skin of a wolf. They instructed him to remove his clothing and put on the wolf skin. Afraid of angering them, the boy complied. Afterward, they led him into the chamber where the dead woman's body had been placed. There, the witches explained the first step of the initiation ritual: a heinous desecration act connected to the corpse that horrified the boy the moment he understood what they were asking him to do. Thinking quickly, he asked if he could step outside briefly to relieve himself. At first, the witches refused, but after some time they allowed him to go outside under supervision. When the men escorting him turned their backs, the boy ran. He ran as fast as he could into the darkness. The witches chased after him, but in their human forms, they were unable to catch him immediately. Knowing they might transform at any moment, the boy hid inside the hollow trunk of a dead pine tree until he heard them pass. After the voices faded and the woods became quiet again, he climbed out and made his way back home. Later, he told others what had happened and how close he had become to becoming part of the ritual. Stories like this are one reason the subject of skinwalkers is rarely discussed openly within Navajo communities. Many people believe that speaking about them too openly can draw their attention. Because of that belief, traditional teachings focus less on curiosity and more on warnings and protection. After hearing the stories, the rituals, and the encounters tied to skinwalker lore, one question naturally follows. If these beings exist within Navajo belief, how do people protect themselves from them? Well, traditional teachings tend to focus less on hunting or confronting them and more on avoiding them altogether. One of the most common warnings within Navajo culture is not to speak about skinwalkers openly. Many people believe that speaking their name can attract their attention. Fear itself is also thought to give them power over a situation, which is one reason the topic is often avoided or discussed carefully. Some accounts suggest that skinwalkers remain human beneath whatever form they take. Because of that, certain traditions say that they can be harmed by ordinary weapons. One teaching suggests that when a skinwalker is disguised as a coyote or wolf, the correct place to shoot is the neck rather than the head. The reasoning behind this idea is that the animal head belongs to the pelt itself, while the human head would be positioned within the neck area of the hide. Other traditions present something very different. In those accounts, normal bullets and weapons may have little effect on them, particularly when they are using spiritual practices associated with transformation. Some stories claim that bullets could pass through them without causing harm. Instead, weapons that have been blessed or prepared through ceremonial practices such as blades or arrows used in ritual are considered more effective against something with that level of spiritual power. Certain ceremonial protections are also said to offer defense. One example involves ash taken from a fireplace that has been prayed over. This ash can be used as a form of spiritual protection. In many traditions, blessings and ritual objects given by respected spiritual leaders carry more importance than physical weapons. People are also warned about what not to do during an encounter. Taking photographs, collecting objects, or bringing items home from the location of an encounter is strongly discouraged. The concern is that the harmful spirit energy connected to the entity could attach itself to the object. Bringing something like that home could invite illness, misfortune, or other forms of spiritual harm to the person or their family. If someone thinks they may have been targeted or cursed by a skinwalker, the only reliable solution within traditional teachings is to seek help from a powerful Navajo medicine man or spiritual leader. Through specific ceremonies and prayers, the healer may be able to remove the curse and sometimes redirect the harmful energy back toward the witch responsible. Whether someone interprets these stories literally or views them as cultural warnings, skinwalkers represent something very specific within Navajo belief. They are not framed as demons or creatures from another world. Instead, they are understood as human beings who chose to abandon morality and embrace the darkest possible path. In that sense, the skinwalker represents the worst parts of human nature, someone who willingly breaks the most sacred rules of their community in pursuit of power, a person who becomes the embodiment of taboo and evil. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Darkly Speaking. I hope this episode helped shed clearer and more accurate light on some of the darker truths behind skinwalker lore. If you're interested in learning more or hearing perspectives from someone who grew up on the Navajo Reservation, I highly recommend checking out the YouTube channel at Sean Clan Shadow Productions. If you want to explore the topic from an anthropological perspective, I also recommend the book Navajo Witchcraft by Clyde Clacone. And if there's a piece of folklore you'd like for me to explore next, or if you have a scary story or an encounter of your own, you know where to find me. You can submit your stories and case requests to darklyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com or head over to our website at darklyspeakingpodcast.com. In the meantime, if you want more dark stories and content, don't forget to follow us on socials at Darkly Speaking Podcast. Until next time, remain cautious. And if you ever find yourself alone at night, far from the lights of town, and something begins tapping at your window or standing in the road just beyond your headlights, it may not be a skinwalker. But if you're somewhere in the Southwest and something about the situation just doesn't feel right, my advice is simple. Leave. Get away as fast as you can and pray that you can escape. Hope to see you next time with a brand new episode.